Happy Wednesday. It's market rate update day. And the big news right now for today is going to be Consumer Price Index, CPI. That's an inflation reading that we get monthly. Now, we get two inflation reports every month. One CPI, the other one's PCE. Now, PCE is the Fed's more preferred reading, but we get these readings twice a month. They're typically market movers in some form or fashion. Um, and if you've been watching any of the videos recently, or if this one is the first one in a while, let me catch you up. We've been seeing inflation readings leveling off, showing signs of maybe inflation going back up, and that's caused a little bit of trepidation in the market. So that's why we've been seeing rates moving up, back up again, because the fight against inflation just doesn't seem to be quite over. And I want to go a little bit deeper into the inflation readings today because there are some mixed messages that are being sent out. I just saw recently that one of the major news networks said that inflation's actually up. And if you do look at the headline inflation number, it does show that inflation is up 0.2%. But that's not really what Wall Street typically looks at, and that's not what the Fed is looking at. And that's what ultimately is what matters is how is the Fed interpreting data? What have they told us in the past? What data do they look at and how do they interpret it? So, what we want to look at is more than just a headline, overall inflation data, but we want to look at core inflation data. And core inflation data means that they're taking out food and energy, which are very volatile, right? There's a lot of things that can affect prices and they can go up and down very quickly. So, when we take out food and energy, it allows us to take a look at inflation for other goods and other services, um, and get a better pulse on how the inflation is moving over the course of time. So let's start off with the basics before we start drilling down into more detailed the more details of the CPI report. So what we're going to look at this chart, and this one's just breaking down something very similar. So we got as similar as to what I was just mentioning, CPI, you got less food and energy. That's going to be the dark blue line. So this is when we talk about inflation, we say core inflation, that means we're taking out food and energy. That's at 3.3% year over year. That means we're still feeling inflation above the target range of 2% at a 3.3% increase. So, if, for example, that means if something cost $10 last year, this year it's now going to cost $13.33. That's what inflation means when we're talking about it going up 3.3%. Now, there's another line that I put on here, and that is going to be core inflation minus shelter. One of the big components right now, and that has really been pushing up inflation, is shelter. Now, it makes up about 35% of the reading for core inflation. And you can see if you take shelter out, inflation's at 2.09%. The Fed's target goal is 2%. And this is just more of getting an idea of where is a lot of this upward pressure on inflation coming from. A lot of people are pointing to housing or shelter as a high cost component. So I wanted to show the difference here when you look at 3.33% for the core inflation and you look at taking out shelter and we're at 2.09, you can see, and we can see on this chart here too, that the rate of inflation has come down quite significantly. Now it's just trying to find out where are we feeling that upward pressure on the inflation. We take out food, we take out energy, which are highly volatile and susceptible to a number of things, right? Food can be affected by weather. Food can be affected by war. Same thing with energy, right? We talk about fuel prices. Fuel prices can be affected by OPEC. It could be affected, and just wars are another example, right? Same thing with food. So we take those out. And Fed really wants to look at elements that they feel like that they can control with the federal funds rate. Let's dive a little bit deeper though. Let's look at another chart, kind of give you a better idea. This gives you somewhat of an idea, right, of where how influential shelter is in these components. But when you start to take a look at other components and how they're measured, so we can look at we actually can include food and energy in here. So if we look at how food, energy, services, housing costs, and goods, what percentage they account for in the inflation data, we can get a really good idea here. So looking back during COVID, you can see Goods and services, which is the light green at the very top, goods and services, they were accounting for a large portion of inflation. Naturally, right, we saw a lot of new services come out of COVID that were born out of COVID, right, out of necessity that people started paying for. We started working from home, so new services, whether, for example, cleaning services, you're spending more time at home. Maybe you're going to spend more money on cleaning. You've got DoorDash, you've got a lot of other services that brought your goods to you instead of you going out to go get them. So we saw a lot increase the inflation in goods or in services, and then you can also see in goods also got more expensive, right? Remember those shortages, those the inventory shortages, good shortages, where then things started getting more expensive because there wasn't enough of it to go around, whatever it would be. Cars are a great example. Car prices went up and they've stayed elevated because of shortage of inventory. Sounds very familiar to houses, doesn't it, real estate agents, right? Shortage of houses means how home prices go up. And then it kind of shifted, right? The Fed was thinking, hey, listen, if we make it more expensive to borrow money, we should see inflation come back down. Well, inflation has come down. We've seen how services are no longer a major part of inflation, but what has taken up a good chunk of that, what's replaced that, has been housing. Housing has grown, rents have gone up, buying a house is more expensive, so housing is taking up a large component of the inflation data. So you can see that along with services is still a good chunk there. Food not as much. Look how the rate of inflation for food has decreased. Don't get me wrong. Does not Just because the rate of inflation has gone down does not mean the food prices went down. It just means that the prices aren't going up as quickly as they had been. Some good news though, if we look at energy, we can see energy has actually we have some depreciation in energy, which is good news there. Um, so and we're also seeing in the services a depreciation in services as well. So what we really need to see and what the Fed needs to see too is that housing expense, that inflation decrease on housing. That'll help the CPI and PCE number come down, right? And as we see the inflation decrease, that means we will see better mortgage rates over time. Now, the question is, when is it going to happen, right? And that's the tough part, is we've been seeing inflation kind of level off for the past couple of months, and that really hasn't bode well for us mortgage and real estate professionals when we're expecting lower interest rates. And if you're a consumer, we're wanting to see that too, right? Because that means lower interest rates means allows us to go out, purchase a home maybe we really would like, at a lower cost. So the Fed target rate, this is another big one. Why do I talk about the Fed so much, Brian? Brian, why do you talk about the Fed so much? Well, the Fed's extremely important in what on really just in our daily, not just in our daily lives, right? But as professionals in the mortgage and real estate industry, the Fed is important because their actions dictate what's going to happen on from Wall Street. So you see, the Fed is responsible for making sure that the economy is stable, that they can control inflation, and that they are maximizing employment as best as possible. And they feel like they can control this by changing their Fed's funds rate. That's the rate that everybody talks about. That's the rate in which banks borrow money to each other, loan money to each other overnight. And as the Fed adjusts that number, it sends ripple effects through the economy. So when the Fed increased, hiked their rates a couple of years ago, what that did was it increased the cost of banks loaning money to each other. It was more expensive to borrow money. And what happens is that gets rolled on down to the consumer, right? That's like a trickle down effect. We always know that when the cost of producing a product goes up, the consumer is the one who ultimately ends up absorbing that. So if the Fed is going to maintain a higher rate for longer, that means mortgage rates are most likely going to remain higher for longer until it becomes clear and evident that the Fed will start cutting rates. Or if there is a path that is clear and evident, then the rates will move accordingly. So some of you may have seen this chart before. This is kind of Wall Street's idea of what the Fed's going to do and how it's changed. So this solid blue line, this is where we're at right now. Right now, we are at 4.75%. The anticipation right now coming up in December is that the rate will be cut to 4.5. So that's highly anticipated. So that is not going to shock anybody if the Fed or when the Fed cuts rates in December by another 0.25%. That's not going to be a market mover at all. Wall Street's already anticipating it. It is not going to catch anybody by surprise. But what this shows you is when we're looking at the dashed line, so the one that goes further down, that was what Wall Street was thinking rates were going to be, or what were the path of rate cuts, what they were going to be over the next course of the year. So a month ago, this is what they thought it was going to look like. And now you can see a month later that has changed. So as of today, it matches what Wall Street was thinking a year ago. The only other exception would be maybe a longer pause and a rate cut middle of next year. That would be about the only change from today, from a week ago. But from a month ago, it's a very different picture. That means rates are going to be elevated a little bit more, a little bit longer than what Wall Street was thinking a month ago, which means the cost of borrowing money is going to be higher for longer, which means if you're already saying it out loud, that means mortgage rates are probably going to be a little bit higher for longer. Now, this is just how Wall Street is feeling right now. This isn't set in stone. It really comes back to what's going to happen on these economic reports. Just wanted to put some color on this, give you an idea of what is CPI, what are these inflation reports, and what do they mean? What are they looking at? So hopefully this answers some questions. And if not, leave me a comment, let me know, and I'll be more than happy to try to address that and provide some more color and commentary. So I'm Brian McIntosh, mortgage loan officer. Hope you guys are doing well. I'll talk to you later.